Welcome, everyone, to a very special week of the Brain Warriors Way podcast. We have returning for the third or fourth time because we love him, and he just will help you so much. We have neurologist Dr. David Perlmutter, who's a #1 New York Times bestselling author. He wrote Grain Brain and Brain Maker. I love both of those books. If you want to know about the gut-brain connection, Brain Maker's just brilliant. David's won lots of awards. He is a masterful teacher. His books have been published in 34 languages. He's been interviewed on Larry King Live, CNN, Fox News, Fox and Friends, Today's Show, Oprah, Dr. Oz. And, you know, I just think of him like a brother.
I think of him like a mentor. Long before I knew you, I was following you, Dr. Perlmutter, and taking your courses. So it's such an honor and a treat for me because I've started following you, 11 years ago? At IFM, 10 years ago, maybe. And I've been following you ever since.
I'm just going to say it's such an honor and a treat for me to be able to spend time with you guys as well. I think back to the time in Los Angeles that, Dan, you and I had breakfast together and got some one-on-one time, and it was really very, very special for me. And I really love what you guys do, the information that you're putting out, and I really honor it. So thank you as well.
Thank you.
So, brainwash.
Great title, by the way.
There's so
Great
many
title.
ways to go with brainwash, from what's happening in our society to getting proper sleep. Your
to
brain
cleaning
needs
your
to
brain,
wash
right.
itself. Why is this book next for you?
This is a level book. As you know, it was written with Austin Perlmutter, our son, internal medicine MD. And it is the manifestation of a conversation that he and I had in this very room, as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, when we were lamenting over the fact that patients didn't do as they were told to do. Meaning, we were doing the best we can to learn as much information as we possibly could, spending our lives becoming as informed as we could, then doing the best we could to give that information out to as many people as would listen, including the one-on-one interaction with patients. And yet, most of the time, that information didn't translate into action. So we wanted to figure out what is keeping patients from understanding what good choices are, but not making those choices. And we began to explore the whole notion of how a person makes a decision, and whether that decision is short-sighted and impulsive, or that decision is based on consideration, for example, of the long-term consequences, good or bad, of what we decide to do today. In healthcare, that's things like, in our world anyway, the lifestyle changes, diet, exercise, sleep, you name it. In most medicine, it's taking the medication that your doctor prescribed. Either way, what we know is that most patients don't follow through. So we began exploring the neuroanatomical correlates of decision-making, and realized that good, thoughtful decision-making that looks at the future is really a prefrontal cortex type of activity, an activity that comes from the front part of the brain, if you will, as opposed to more impulsive activity that comes from more primitive parts of the brain, areas of the brain, for example, that include the amygdala. We began to realize that so much of our modern lifestyle locks us into making decisions that don't involve the prefrontal cortex, that don't bring the adult into the room. And that it was wrong of us over the years to be thinking in an accusatory way about our patients and their lack of follow-through, their lack of ability to make good changes. And that the deck is stacked against each and every one of us by the food that is so common today being pro-inflammatory, our lack of exercise, what we call sedentarity, our lack of exposure to nature, our non-restorative sleep, our disconnection from nature. All of these things disconnect us from the good decision part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and we termed that disconnection syndrome. because of all of the multiple manifestations that we see from disconnecting to the prefrontal cortex, or as you, Dan, have called it, hypofrontality, as it relates to what you're able to see on your SPECT scans. The fact that the prefrontal cortex, that gift that we have as humans, other animals, of course, have a prefrontal cortex, but a third of our cortex is the prefrontal cortex. It's a generous gift that we've been given. That when we disconnect from that, we disconnect not only from making good choices, good decisions, but we disconnect from the part of the brain that allows empathy and allows compassion and tends to tamp down the us versus them mentality that is so pervasive today. So we really embraced how the world today really fosters our disconnection from this prefrontal cortex.
Wow.
Which is why you should never let a child hit a soccer ball with their head, and especially a little girl, because what I've read is 90% of their IQ is housed in their prefrontal cortex, where for males it's more widely distributed. And we just don't think about it. It is what I'm now going to term the oblivious bad habit dragon, that people go through their lives without thinking, without using their prefrontal cortex.
Can I throw something in there as a patient? Because a couple of times now I've had 10 medical surgeries, but 2 of those surgeries, after surgery, I just didn't feel like myself. So I wonder if sometimes some of the things we have to go through as people to actually maintain our health can affect us so negatively. Just a couple of years ago, I had a surgery and I just didn't come out feeling as motivated, or I felt like I was walking through mud, harder to follow through with my own lifestyle. And so many people don't understand that when they, there's so many things that affect us, anesthesia, hormones. I mean, all those things are adding to that, are they not?
They are. And, one of the biggest players here is something that you guys have talked about for quite some time, and it's inflammation. And, people are embracing the notion that inflammation is a cornerstone of our chronic degenerative conditions, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, you name it, and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's for that matter, and depression for that matter. But, the recognition that inflammation is helping us disconnect from the prefrontal cortex is really profound information. Why? Because then when we can contextualize all of our lifestyle choices through the lens of inflammation, we realize that what's happening globally, for example, with respect to diet and the enhancement of inflammation that is causing, is changing the mindset of the world's population such that it's fostering more impulsivity, more fear, more us versus them, and taking the global population away from thoughtful decisions and empathy and compassion. Not just empathy for the other person, but empathy for our future selves, and even empathy for the planet itself. So it becomes a bit of an existential discussion that we're having right now, which we've jumped to fairly quickly. But we're just centering, for example, on the westernization of the global diet, meaning the more inflammation being produced by the diet that's spreading around the planet. Yes, it has implications for chronic degenerative conditions. We know that. But it has implications for how each of us sees our neighbor, sees other countries, and sees the health and our role to play in the health of the planet.
Well, and the prefrontal cortex is also the mirror neuron system. So your ability to empathize or sort of know the mind of other people. And if we damage that, we really become self-centered as individuals, which then damages our marriages, damages our ability to parent effectively, and so on. Inflammation.
Can I comment on that real quickly? It brings up an interesting thought, because it's fundamentally important that we take a deep breath and try to embrace the views of another person. And that is to say, to see things through somebody else's eyes, from their perspective. Understand and embrace what another person's life might be and how they might see the world. You can call that walking the mile in another man's moccasins or however, but We don't do that very much anymore. We dig into our frame of reference, end of story, and that is more and more deeply entrenched by where people spend their time, for example, on social media, that only caters to their way of thinking. We need to embrace other people's views. We need diversity of opinion. Diversity begets resilience. And we absolutely need that if we're going to make it through, some of the big challenges of our day.
That's so interesting. Just since with knowing our work and connecting it with what you're saying, that the few people I know that are hyper frontal, that like have really busy, they're the opposite of ADD, rather than having sleepy frontal lobes, are super hyper frontal. Like you being one of them, my daughter being another one, very much empathize with other people. Like always, the first words out of her mouth will be, but wait, what about the other side? What about, and I'm like, how does she do that? It's so young. And I wonder if part of it is that frontal lobe action.
Well, they're so important. Now, when they work too hard, it's been associated with OCD. And, I think of the prefrontal cortex as the brain's brake. And it stops you from saying the first stupid thing you think. Jerry Seinfeld Jerry Seinfeld once said the brain is a sneaky organ. We all have weird, crazy, stupid, sexual, violent thoughts that nobody should ever hear. But
that's exactly right. That's one of the major functions of the prefrontal cortex, is to really allow us to be emotionally appropriate in terms of our responses. So again, it is this we call this top-down control, where it exercises control over what would otherwise be impulsive outbursts, impulsive activity. And we see glaring examples these days in which individuals simply respond immediately without thinking. And, there is no adult in the room. So we've got to, recognize that we need to think through what we do, what we say, how we act. And it gets back to, we need to think through our decision making. So interestingly then, making bad decisions by eating, for example, the wrong foods, by not exercising, not getting enough restorative sleep, fans the flames of inflammation that further disconnects us from that very area, and it's a feed-forward cycle. What we bring to bear in the new book, Brainwash, are the ways to break those cycles. How do we jump back in and regain control? Otherwise, it's your teenagers at home when mom and dad are going to go away for the weekend, and the teenagers are there, and I might add, with 30 of their closest friends. Right. It's not going to work out really well.
Boy, that happened at home. You just re-traumatized me for when my daughter Caitlin.
You know exactly what I'm saying.
The house was under construction. I had to go away for business. She's supposed to stay with her sister. And my mom went over and found 30 children in the house under construction. One other thought before we have to go to the next podcast is when the prefrontal cortex works too hard, people end up with OCD. So if you just think of this break, it needs to be healthy, but I guess if you think of anorexia, it's their brake is working too hard and they can't stop. So it's this balance. If the brake's always on, you can't get down the road. But if you don't have a brake, you're going to die.
Right.
And so keeping the prefrontal cortex healthy, not inflamed, is a critical part to being human. When we come back, we are going to talk about how to take control and strengthen the prefrontal cortex by new strategies in Dr. David Perlmutter's brand new book, Brainwash, on sale January 14th. So by the time this podcast comes out, it'll already be on sale, and like his other recent books, will be a bestseller, and we'll do everything we can to help it be that way. Stay with us.
Appreciate that.
We are going to start your new year, your new decade off with a bang. Tan and I are going to do a 6-week live class. So starting January 21st, every Tuesday, we're going to be with you for an hour. And at the end, we're going to give away over $20,000 in prizes. We look forward to helping you kick off this new year by becoming brain health revolutionaries.
Welcome back. We are still enjoying this week with our friend and my mentor, Dr. David Perlmutter, and we're talking about his book, Brainwash, which is just so interesting. Why patients don't do what they should do, knowing that it's going to help them, and all the reasons why and what they can do to change that. So in this episode, we're going to talk about strategies, right, to break that cycle from what we talked about in the last episode.
And I love the fact that you wrote it with your son, because it's, as authors and doctors, we love what we do, but ultimately the most important thing we do is train the next generation of healers. And the fact that you could do that must have been very special for you.
Train the next generation of healers, work on a project with a family member, with someone I love. I mean, it checked all the boxes. And I don't think I've said this before, but Austin really proved to be my mentor throughout this process.
Wow.
Really was incredibly circumspect about not extrapolating too much from the data. I sometimes will extrapolate from animal studies to humans. I'll call it out, but I maybe gloss it over a little bit. But he was really very, very circumspect about all of those aspects about writing this book. And gosh, hundreds and hundreds of references that he cultivated. Quick, funny story. Whenever over the last summer, as we were collecting references, I would find a reference, I would send it to him. And then one day I said, Austin, are you collecting? What are you doing with all these references? And he said, Dad, every time you send me a reference, I make a little yellow sticky note and I put it up on the refrigerator. And that's as far as it gets. And for a moment I went, oh. And then I realized, of course, he was kidding. Everything went into a Google Drive in a specific file and was organized better than I had ever done. So it was a terrific experience, and to be able to share his perspective from his generation about the implications of what we've written versus my generation and my demographic, if you will, because many of the things that we call out that are hacking into our ability to make good decisions, like digital exposure, social media, et cetera, I think are far more germane considerations as it relates to his generation and even younger generations than perhaps for ours. And so that was actually very, very important. We realized that the average American is spending more than 6 hours a day in front of one screen or another, be it their smartphone, tablet, computer, or television, which in a typical lifetime amounts to 22 years of screen time. And we can discuss what that might be doing to the brain in terms of the corpus callosum, et cetera. But beyond that, one of the important points of the book is that when you're doing one thing, you're not doing something else. You're not preparing a meal, exercising, getting out in nature, connecting with other people in a direct physical way, not paying attention to your sleep hygiene, you name it, not meditating, all the things that we will now, I guess, talk about in terms of being able to regain connection, not just to the prefrontal cortex, but regain connection to ourselves, neighbors, communities, and to our planet.
So why the name Brainwash for this book?
I would like to say that that was something that was in the back of our minds for many years. It wasn't. It was developed by our publisher, and they loved it because it's attention grabbing because we don't want to be brainwashed. But then with the bubbles on the cover and everything, people realize it's a positive brainwash. We're trying to clean the brain. We're trying to offload a lot of negative influences that we're all exposed to throughout the course of our days today, and to reestablish connection to that prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that really allows us to be the people that we want to be. And people are starting to get the idea that, well, the brain washes itself, for example, by activation of the glymphatic system at night when we're in deep sleep. People sort of get that there is a way of cleaning the brain. Well, this is a broader net that is thrown in terms of actually rewiring the brain. And it's not rewiring or new wiring. It's sort of rewiring it back to how it used to be before it was hacked by this incredible exposure to the digital world that's taking our attention, that's putting a premium on our eyeballs in terms of where we go, being hacked by the addition, for example, of sugar to 68% of the 1.2 million foods that are sold in America's grocery stores, being hacked by the mentality that if you want to be
you need to say
productive,
that again.
you
68% of the foods in the grocery store.
That's
this
crazy.
includes the produce department, the meat
just
department.
Crazy.
The thing that triggered it for me is I was on McDonald's website once because, when you travel, I'm always trying to find healthier alternatives.
Sure.
I'm like, well, their salads are probably healthier. And then in the grilled chicken salad, in the grilled chicken, they had orange juice, which of course has sugar in it, which breaks it down, makes it easier to chew. So you're out of the restaurant faster. And I'm just like grilled chicken and sugar. It just hit me in the face that it's a war out there, hence the Brain Warriors Way.
And that's
podcast.
our mission. Our mission is to empower through education. Ultimately, people are going to make their own decisions, but I think when we present this information, then we're balancing the information input so people can make more balanced decisions because, hey, well, even orange juice, well, that sounds really natural. Well, a 12-ounce glass of orange juice, that's 36 grams of sugar. It's the same as drinking a can of Coke. So that's important for people to know. Well, what about the vitamin C? Well, the 60 milligrams of vitamin C doesn't offset 36 grams of sugar. Thank you very much.
Eat an orange and be done with it.
Yeah, right. Eat the orange if you have to.
Right.
But that said, in looking at how diet is rewiring our brains and affecting our decision making, locking us into making further bad choices as it relates to the diet that we choose. Wow, that is, as we mentioned before, a powerful feed-forward cycle. How our diets increase our body habitus, our weight, and leading to obesity, that further is associated with more impulsive decision-making the very next day. One recent study demonstrated that chronic sleep deprivation is associated with an average increased caloric consumption on a daily basis of 380 kilocalories, and without a concomitant increase in energy expenditure. So that's 380 calories more input each day, while at the same time, realizing you're not going to burn that off. And that's makes for more obesity, which makes for poor decision making.
Well, an extra 300 calories a day is probably 40 pounds of fat a year on your body. And so it's like, well, no wonder we're always on a diet. And they go after these diet companies that give you foods that are just loaded with toxins, which, is another, we call them weapons of mass destruction. So
that's right. Biological warfare on your plate. And, we've said that there are some amazing books out there that you've written, that our colleagues have written, and they're worthless. They're absolutely worthless unless people act on the information that they are given. You write wonderful books, but what good is it if it sits on the shelf and there's no action? So we developed Brainwash to really be the bridge then between information and action. Okay. New Year's resolution, call it what you will, but to implement this really good information was really the step that we wanted to focus on, our decision making to really bring about change. And, it's the decision making that will ultimately allow us to be more caring individuals of each other and, of our planet, as I mentioned earlier.
And no better time than at the beginning of a new decade. So it's not just the beginning of a new year, but it's the beginning of a new decade. And we have to begin to change this crazy increase in illnesses that are under our control once we know how to take control of our brains. And that's what you talk about in Brainwash. When we come back, we're going to talk about how to detoxify your mind, which of course starts by detoxifying your brain. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are here with our friend, integrative neurologist David Perlmutter. His brand new book, Brainwash, is out everywhere to help you make better decisions, how to really implement what you've learned from his other books and from our books, how to put it in your life day to day. And in this podcast, we're going to talk about detoxifying your mind. So just like when you go on a detox diet to flush out the toxins in your body and cleanse your organs, it's also helpful to flush out the toxins from your mind. And for me, it just triggered toxic people because people are contagious. Toxic digital
news.
The news, and the news is not just the news; it's clickbait. I was watching
a bunch of sound bites
the news this morning because there's all sorts of stuff going on in the world, and every headline was breaking news because they're wanting to hook your amygdala. You had mentioned that in our first podcast. They want to get your fear center to put you into action before your prefrontal
and half the
cortex
time
can
the
rein
story
it in.
isn't what they say it's going to be. And I'm one of those people who starts yelling at the TV. So I realized early on I need to not watch the news. I grab the headlines, I turn it off.
What that looks like.
She yells at the TV. Yes,
So
better
the
TV than me.
Network.
But talk to us, David, about detoxifying your mind.
There's a lot of discussion about toxins in our environment, be they heavy metals or glyphosate in our food and antibiotics and all the various things. Particulate matter, for example, that we're exposed to happens to be associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's. But I think the major toxins that don't get the attention that they absolutely deserve are ones that you just alluded to, and that is these toxins that infiltrate our brains to put us in a sense of fear and to lock us into more primitive brain function. You mentioned the amygdala, for example, an area that has a role to play in impulsivity, in narcissism, in short-sighted thinking, and really an area that fosters an us versus them mentality. And we don't need that anymore. We need to recognize that the them are on the same ride that we are on, and we need to embrace the them, whoever the them might be. So we need to distance ourselves from this type of thinking and as such reconnect to higher order brain thinking, as we talked about prefrontal cortex.
I like that.
And that is bringing the prefrontal cortex back online, reestablishing connection, offsetting what we talk about in Brainwash, disconnection syndrome. So what these toxins are, for example, our digital experiences. We know that by and large, we are subjected to hacking every moment that we are online. By ads that pop up, by the next YouTube video that happens to, interestingly, be quite similar to what we just watched, that have been manipulated through artificial intelligence to gain our attention, through the clickbait, Dan, that you had mentioned, et cetera. Things that take us down a rabbit hole of mindlessness. Yeah. And we developed in Brainwash an acronym. I know you guys love acronyms. We call it the test of time. T-I-M-E. T. How much time are you willing to dedicate for whatever the online adventure you want to pursue? If you're writing a book, whatever you want to do, trying to reconnect with your friends from high school, how much time today am I going to spend doing that task? I. Is it intentional? What is my goal? What am I trying to accomplish? M. Am I mindful during the experience? Am I aware of what's going on? Or am I suddenly drawn away by a misleading thought or something that captivates me? Much as what happens during meditation, for example. We know when we meditate, we try to stay in a certain place, but we have intrusive thoughts, and we gently and lovingly bring ourselves back. That same sort of mindfulness needs to be brought to our digital experiences. And finally, E, T-I-M-E, is it enriching? Mm-hmm. Are you net positive when it's all said and done? Or when it's all said and done, was that wasted time? Were you taken away to be manipulated, basically? And, to be clear, we're not anti-technology. I write my books. based upon an unlimited access to information. The internet has been a powerful tool to democratize knowledge globally, pretty much for people who have access to it. So we're absolutely not anti-technology, but it's to use technology as a powerful resource, not to, as was said in 1921 by Christian Lang, Nobel Prize winner, technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. Yeah. So we've got to use technology and not be abused by it, not let technology and those people who are tinkering with it be the master puppeteers of our attention and ultimately where we spend our money and spend our time.
You know, it's so interesting. We had just done a podcast about the dangers of social media and the internet for children, and it was a really great podcast. And I think we have this tendency to think, well, as adults, you know, especially if you're adults who know the problems that this can cause, know the adverse effects, we won't be subjected to that. And I have to tell you how sneaky it is. It was not even a week after that I was doing Christmas shopping. I hate shopping. So I was doing Christmas shopping online, and all of a sudden something caught my attention, and I end up on Instagram, and within 5 minutes, I'm going, wait, why does that woman who's my age look like that? And I go down this complete rabbit hole of nonsense, complete useless waste of my time. Now, fortunately, because of what we do.
That is a powerful tool.
Yeah.
Right there. What you just characterized is a very powerful tool that creates problem and solution. Problem is generally you don't measure up.
Right.
You're not thin enough, pretty enough. I'm not strong enough, rich enough, tall enough, you name it.
Right.
And here's the solution. And
And I thought I was immune to it.
You're exactly right.
So,
and that's a powerful tool, always has been in marketing, problem and solution based. And it's just one of the many tools that is used in our digital worlds and beyond to make us fear that we're deficient in some area. And here is the quick way to fix that. And, you know, it's seductive and it's addictive. And we talk about addictions, and generally people think that, you know, to be compromised by an addiction, you have to have a needle hanging out of your arm. Well, people can be absolutely compromised by their addiction to internet time, their addiction to online shopping. There are a lot of things these days that can ultimately form addictions that can be profoundly maladaptive to an individual in terms of his or her happiness, his or her availability to participate in life, and ultimately fostering discontent.
Right.
And the way that we are hacked into is these are quick avenues for us to think that we're going to be content. Mm-hmm. But content means having enough. And if you're constantly trying to feed that, chase the dragon of to feel content by buying these things and doing these things that you're seeing, for example, online, you are by definition not content, nor will you ever be content. And you're locking yourself into the amygdala because you are locking yourself into impulsivity. And to get back to the original question, that's a powerful, powerful, immediate toxin that is rewiring our brains. And that was one of our major goals in Brainwash, is to call it out as a toxin and then to provide the tools for detox.
Right.
You know, I want to just go back to I'm not enough, because I think that is driving the epidemic rise in teenage suicide, especially among girls, is because of social media and exactly the path that you described. Now, with your intelligence and your experience, you could override
more
it.
Life experience than anything.
You could override it. But imagine this happening to a developing brain that is vulnerable and lonely. According to a new study in the United Kingdom, 90% of the young adults said that they had loneliness issues. They actually created a minister of loneliness. It's if they're lonely and then they feel less than, they're more likely to feel hopeless and helpless.
Well, and you have to know, like, I love your description of the evil ruler, because you have to understand, like, you can be doing something as innocent as last minute Christmas shopping, and the next thing you know, that clickbait is there. They know what they're doing. And
they have your history.
Right.
So they
have your
know
entire history.
That you may be vulnerable.
Right.
to
And the next thing you know, that pops
issue.
up on your. So this is. It's not like an innocent thing that's happening. It's an intentional thing that's happening. So we have to be equally intentional.
Aggressive, and it is the evil ruler. And
right.
A couple things you said. Well, and I think you meant me. I am able to override it. That was the words that you used. And override means what? It means bringing online the prefrontal cortex to bring the adult back into the room to make a better decision. Well, plenty of adults cannot override. Right. Because they suffer from disconnection syndrome. They suffer from disconnection of the prefrontal cortex's ability to do exactly that, to override, and they're basically functioning from an amygdala level.
The primitive.
That functionality is enhanced by not enough restorative sleep, not enough nature exposure, not eating the low inflammation foods that you've talked about for years, and by the things that happen on our digital experience. And as you well point out, young girls are suffering from what has now been called Snapchat dysmorphia.
Yeah.
Meaning that their perceptions of their looks are profoundly influenced by the ideal characterizations that they are seeing based upon what they see on Snapchat or Instagram or whatever the platform is, to the extent that there's been this incredible upsurge in plastic surgery to make people look like they want to look on social media, or what they think they should look like on social media. And, what does that say? We talk about contentment. That is a glaring example of being discontent. You're not content with your looks. And we've got to really do what we can, A, to call it out, and B, to provide those tools then to allow people to regain a sense of contentment, to stop the comparisons, to realize that whomever you're looking at on social media, that truly, when you get down to it, their lives are not what they are portrayed to
and they
be
don't look like that. I told my daughter, supermodels don't look like supermodels. They're all photoshopped.
All right. When we come back, we're going to talk about eating your way to better brain health. David has been studying this for a very long time. Stay with us.
Welcome back. We are still here with our friend and my mentor, Dr. David Perlmutter, and we're talking about his new book, Brainwash, which I'm really excited about picking up. It's just been so interesting, all the things that affect us in an adverse way. And now we're talking about what we can do, some of the strategies we can use to take control, take back control. Why don't patients do what you tell them to do if they know it's going to help them? Well, it's not just on them. It's because of the society we live in. And I love what you've been saying. So we're talking about how to take control back. And I love that.
So let's talk about food. I know you have thought about food for a very long time. And in Grain, Brain, and Brain Maker, you discuss it at length. You're also a professionally trained nutritionist. We would agree, and we talk about it on the Brain Warriors Way podcast, that you're in war for the health of your brain. In fact, we say that ISIS has nothing on our food industry, that the real weapons of mass destruction are highly processed, pesticide sprayed, high glycemic, low fiber, food-like substances stored in plastic containers that have been raised with antibiotics and hormones. And so, when I looked at your book, I'm like, oh, that sort of fits what David talks about.
Sort of.
Yeah.
So talk about your interest and then how Brainwash can help people take control over their food, because their nucleus accumbens, their pleasure centers, have been purposefully hijacked by the food industry that hires neuroscientists to get foods to be the perfect crunchiness, meltiness, saltiness, to just take over your pleasure centers where cocaine and heroin work.
Well, it's even worse than that. They're now using functional MRI to determine, in fact, what it is about food that lights up areas.
Oh my gosh.
the nucleus accumbens. That's readily available to the food industry.
This has been happening since the early 90s. Home Depot was doing that and I'm like, I get criticized because I want to look at the brain function of my complex psychiatric patients. I mean, I've been called every bad thing you can imagine. And I'm like, Home Depot gets to use it. Pepsi gets to use it.
Food scientists.
And I don't. This is not fair.
I didn't realize that. That's crazy.
You know what? Don't you feel good though? Anyway, when now you've just gone through that. I mean, I remember, this is off topic, but several years ago, I was attacked as well. Somebody wrote this scathing article in a national magazine saying that, oh, Dr. Perlmutter changes his messaging because he used to tell us to eat a low-fat diet, and now he's telling us that some fat is good. There are such a thing as good fats. So he wrote this scathing article, and I remember the next morning, I had an intervention from my publicist and editor and everybody and publisher, and they said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, God bless him.
Right.
I mean,
nothing.
That's the best he could do. And so we let it go.
Right.
But, years ago, I became interested in nutrition and the brain. I mean, those things sound like they are completely disparate, but even to this day, there's very little discussion about the effects of our food choices on the health of our brain. Who knew? And that's where Grain Brain came in. We talked about the damaging effects of sugar and refined carbs on the brain. And now that's certainly part of the discussion. But now, as we move forward with Brainwash, we're realizing that our food choices affect our mood and affect our decision making. That's the news. That what we eat helps us decide in the future what we will eat. That if you choose badly today, if the evil ruler influences you to such an extent that you make bad choices, that fosters continued bad choices moving forward.
Right.
So it's our message then is one of recognizing the fundamental role of inflammation in allowing us to either access the prefrontal cortex or not, and how important it is then to choose wisely, to choose foods that do not foster inflammation. In fact, foods that will tamp down this process. Being careful of the oils and fats that we consume, recognizing that some fats are actually good, to eat foods that are rich in prebiotic fiber, fiber-rich foods in general, foods that are colorful, pretty much a reduction in animal-based foods. We actually, believe it or not, from the Grain Brain author, are advocates now of OMD, 1 meal a day, being entirely plant-based. We chose to do that because of the fact that is associated generally with reduced inflammation. And as a matter of fact, it seems to be environmentally a good recommendation as well. That raised a lot of eyebrows, especially from those who would say that Grain Brain was simply the Atkins diet redux, which it was never intended to be, nor was it. But I think there's great value in recognizing that most of the food that we consume should really be plant-based, and as such will help to reduce inflammation. So food affects our brain wiring, the hard wiring of our brains, allowing us to either remain in contact with our gift, the prefrontal cortex, or locking us into the part of the brain that is causing us to be narcissistic, losing empathy, having decisions that are impulsive and short-sighted, and fostering fear. That's what food does to us. And when we look at food through that lens, then again, what's happening to food globally becomes a very intriguing story, doesn't it?
It sure does. And it's the people that I coach and even myself, I mean, I can totally relate to that. You go through one negative event, whether it's, like with your health or something, and all of a sudden you're down. And then you're down, so your mood changes. And so then you start making bad decisions. And then as your mood changes, you want to be down more. You don't want to get up and go do stuff. And it's just this vicious cycle that all of a sudden just takes control.
You are so correct. But what we're offering then in Brainwash, and in fact, we have a 10-day plan at the end of the book, you don't have to do each part of the 10-day plan. If you leverage a better night's sleep, if you leverage just deciding to dramatically reduce your refined carbohydrates and sugar, or if you leverage the part about reconnecting with nature, for example, it's going to then foster better decision moving forward.
And your mood.
Decision making moving forward, and therefore help you welcome in the other parts of the program.
So
we didn't mention connection to nature. 87% of our day in America is spent indoors, with another 6% spent in our cars, leaving very little time for connection with nature. I'm not saying anything here that we don't all know. We know we feel better. We have a better mood when we're in nature, when we're taking a walk out in nature. We know that from a scientific perspective, our inflammation markers go down, our cortisol levels go down. We re-engage the prefrontal cortex. We tend to calm down the impulsive amygdala. So nature exposure is something we have undervalued, at least in America. We know in Japan, for example, there's tons of research going on, which was something called shirin-yoku, means forest bathing. But it doesn't even have to be that you go out into a national park. Just put a plant in your kitchen, or a photograph of a nature scene in your workplace has been shown to, for example, lower the stress hormone cortisol. These are simple on-ramps to better decision making.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to stop. But what I want you to tell our audience, David, is how can they connect with you? So obviously they can pick up Brainwash, which I gave you a quote because I love that book. How else can they connect with you? I know you have a newsletter. I get it every week, and it's loaded with helpful information. How can our Brain Warriors way
I would say if people are really interested in this information, go to brainwashbook.com. A great resource, I feel, is drperlmutter.com, drperlmutter.com. And one of the things, in addition to the blogs that both I and Austin write, video blogs, written blogs, is we have a very vast resource of scientific literature, the entire PDFs listed, not just the abstracts. And the science part of drperlmutter.com is fully searchable by term. Just go to the magnifying glass. So I would direct people there to learn more information.
Great.
Excellent.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Adore you and are grateful for the work you do in the world, and grateful that you're our friend.
I love you guys, and I always, when I see this time together on my calendar, I always really look forward to it. And we said this off camera, I'll say it on camera. We need to connect more often and have these amazing conversations.
We do, for sure.
Well, we'll look forward to it.
Thank you. If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're considering coming to Amen Clinics or trying some of the brain healthy supplements from BrainMD, you can use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com, or a 10% discount on all supplements at brainmdhealth.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.